Yo, thanks for pulling up to this. I'm really excited to be doing this. I won't say too much because I got a little PowerPoint. So basically, I'll just give you the frame. I made a PowerPoint to kind of like, contextualize what we're about to talk about. Then I'm going to give the floor to Sarah and Jane to kind of speak from their own voices. And then we're going to have a conversation and y'all going to ask us some questions. Cool? All right. Here, let me hit this button real quick. Before I show my PowerPoint, I just want to say like one small thing. I'm a Gen Xer. You know what I'm saying? Like I was a kid growing up in the late 80s, early 90s. These are I stand on the shoulders of Jane and Sarah. So this is like intergenerational solidarity across many lines. And I'm trying to model some shit here that I think is beneficial to us across identities, across genders, across spectrums. So without further ado, here is a probably failed experiment, but let's do that shit anyway. Okay, so to get us started, I want to look at a small clip from the classic film Beat Street.
Yo, Charlie. What's up, Tony? What's going on, my man? Yo, Stone A. Kenny. Go. All right, make a snap, fellas. We're running behind. All right. Go. Yeah. Come on. Let's go, Double K.
Yo, Con. Down, baby.
King Kong, Angie. It's about time. I'm sorry, man. You know, we have some business to take care of, but we're here now, all right? Yo, Kyle, how you doing? All right, go!
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
It's working. It's working. Party people, if you're ready to rock, let me hear you scream. Well, if you really came to party, then let me hear everybody say, we came to party.
We came to party!
Everybody put your hands together like this. Come on, clap.
Yeah.
Let me hear you clap.
Yeah,
Everybody clap. Now here's a funky beat.
All right, Beat Street, ladies and gentlemen. If you haven't seen it, you should. But Beat Street is a film that was produced by Harry Belafonte and is a widely loved film, but it is indeed fiction. Charlie Ahearn's Wild Star is closer to the real thing. So if you haven't seen Wild Style, make sure you see Wild Style. Still, this particular scene has always stood out for me because it gives an accurate depiction of how an abandoned people in a broken city took back their neighborhood, created social fabric, and made their own spaces. So how in the midst of unfathomable this devastation, the people wove together, shared spaces through that and created hip hop culture, which is my roots, and gave the world really like the most influential avant-garde art movement of our time. I mean, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. But this, like I said, in the midst of devastation, and what did that devastation look like? Massive unemployment due to the deindustrialization of the economy, planned shrinkage, which saw the city cut services to the Bronx like sanitation, and the fires orchestrated by greedy landlords looking to collect fire insurance money. Let me say a little something more about that on this slide. So just some statistics for you. The landlord artisans were an epidemic across the city, but the BX got it the worst. 7 different census tracts in the Bronx lost more than 97% of their buildings to fire and abandonment between 1970 and 1980. 44 tracts out of the 289 in the borough lost more than 50%. Between 1975 and 1977, 130,000 units were abandoned in New York City. In the 10 years between 1967 and 1977, about 2 million people have been dispossessed with the Bronx losing 300,000 people. By 1980, the Bronx had surpassed Mississippi's poorest counties, becoming the poorest congressional district in the US. So just to put an idea there. What was happening in the Bronx was one of the most egregious symptoms of the overall dilemma New York City found itself in as the city was on the verge of bankruptcy, right? So the bankruptcy thing about New York is like always like tossed in a lot of language and like a lot of bullshit, but you know, I could give you the gist really quickly. Essentially, the city under the leadership of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who alongside his brother, David Rockefeller, who was the CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank at the time, they racked up enormous short and long-term debt. They squandered the city's tax revenue and created a massive deficiency in the budget, and then borrowed more to pay for the operating expenses and make mortgage payments, basically to their friends. When they could no longer be bailed out at the federal level, they turned their guns towards the people, implementing policies that would become the neoliberal boot we live under today. Across the city, there were wage freezes and layoffs aimed at public sector workers, transit fare hikes, limits on rent control, cuts to welfare benefits, and tuition imposed on the CUNY, the City University of New York system, for the first time. In the end, the public sectors, the workers in the public sector were drawn into complicity with the market virtually against their will. What does that mean? The city forced the public sector to give up their own pension funds to bail New York City out. Initially, the unions resisted this proposal. However, they had many hits. They had taken many hits with like the layoffs, and like they were demoralized because their own leadership basically was like, we won't support a general strike. The city also threatened with defaulting, being like, yo, if we default, your contracts aren't worth shit anyway. So it doesn't matter if you go on strike, we'll just go into default. With their backs against the corner, they gave in. In essence, 350,000 public sector workers put their pensions on the line, making room for bankers to disinvest from New York City, and in the process, stripping the city government, the municipal labor movement, and the working class New Yorkers of much of their power accumulated over the past 3 decades. Why am I giving you all this shit? I'm trying to paint a picture of the spaces, of the context that folks was living through at the time, right? The deep shit that New York was steeped in, you know what I'm saying? Like, but just like in the Bronx and in the rest of the city, amidst its ruins, artists, writers, and musicians were cooking with creativity. So this is a quote from this book called Love Goes to Buildings on Fire. And I'm just gonna read it. Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash, hot wired street parties. Hold on a second. With collage shards of vinyl LPs, the New York Dolls stripped rock and roll till its frame and wrapped it in gender fuck drag. Patti Smith, busting from New Jersey, took a cue from Dylan, combining rock and poetry, blah, blah, blah. Y'all read that shit. But essentially, I'm just trying to give you the gist, right? You know, like people were making shit and people were doing shit, even though like everything was falling apart, literally, you know? And these two badass women joining us today were in the thick of it. New York City had already been a hotbed of cultural production, as noted by Sarah Schulman. New York had always been a place where those individuals who were ostracized or punished, and I'm quoting Sarah directly from Gentrification of the Mind, ostracized or punished in their conforming hometowns came to come out, be artists, have sex, make money, and be independent of their families. Speaking from her experience as someone born and raised in the East Village, who came of age in the 80s, Sarah witnessed firsthand this violent neoliberal transformation and its impact on the people in her community of, quote, freaky, faggy, outrageous, community-based folks who took illegal drugs, hustled literally and figuratively for money, who lived in poverty and included real innovators, real drag queens, real street dykes, real New Yorkers, and really inappropriate risk-taking, sexually free, nihilistic utopians. That sounds like my crowd. I don't know about y'all. On the outskirts of Times Square, the intersection for all of New York City's good, bad, and ugly, really, Jane was painting the hard times and precariousness of the city and what the people were living as they loitered outside her window after dark. Just some examples of that work. Jane, I know you're going to show pictures, so I'm just going to go quick. These are some of my faves. But Jane's network was also an intersection of cultural production between the downtown scene and all of the dope shit that was happening uptown. For example, those artists who created hip hop culture. This practice is evident in Jane's involvement in the now legendary Times Square show, whose promo image by Jane we refurbished as the promo for this event tonight. The Times Square show crossed the paths of many graffiti writers, including Crash, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, and people like Jenny Holster, Kiki Smith, David Hammonds, Tom Otterness. Jane's gonna tell us all about that shit. It's also evident in her involvement with Fashion Moda, which brought these downtown artists into the Bronx to be in conversation with graffiti writers and uptown artists more directly. New York City finds itself once again on the brink of decay. We are neck deep in a housing crisis that has a corrupt shelter system bursting at the seams as rising rents force families and young people into their beds, thereby forcing the mentally ill, unhoused populations into the subways and the streets, where Eric Adams is going to get them. This while we are surrounded by blocks and blocks and blocks of empty luxury condos operating as tax havens. This has been the case for years now, but with the effect that COVID has had on the city, we find ourselves among the ruins. Not entirely like the 80s, but it certainly invokes it. Bachelor's degree conferrals in the arts have remained substantially above average for the past 30 years. Whether inside art schools or not, the fact is that more and more people are self-identifying as artists. With this in mind, I wonder what we might learn from how artists seize space alongside communities and how we might do that today in the face of this looming crisis that keeps unfolding on us all. Angela Davis reminds us that artists are the light bearers of imagination and that we must cultivate the imagination at any cost, because if we lose this faculty, we lose our ability to imagine our way to break out of our subjugation. So, what can we learn from what they accomplished back then, during this like neoliberal cusp? What spaces were we able to create? What are the failures? How did Jane and Sarah perceive the neoliberal changes unfolding through the 80s? What kind of new formations, new spaces, and new ways of being, making, and living are possible at this moment? That's really where we're at with it. All right. So with that, I think I'm gonna pass it to Sarah, and then we'll pass it to Jane. Yeah?
Okay.
Sarah, I just said a mouthful. I know you're about to drop a mic on me.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. So I'm a writer, and I want to talk about the role of oppositional writers and underground writers in creating the AIDS activist movement of the 1980s. When I was 21, I dropped out of college and I came back to New York, and I started working as a reporter for the feminist and gay press. At the time, nothing feminist and nothing queer was ever reported in any corporate media. And there was a huge subculture. And every city in the country had at least one feminist and one queer newspaper. Some had more. So all of us worked for free. And our job was to find out what were the stories, what was really happening with our communities, what was really going on out there. We had huge mistrust that was completely justified of the mainstream media. And once you decided to be out in 1979, you were not going to get a job in the mainstream media. These were two completely different worlds. Even if you were in academia, if you look at the first books of the most famous queer academics, of that first generation, you will see their first books were not queer. It was two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I chose the one less traveled by. So in 1979, just to set the context, it was before Reagan was elected. It was the Republican Party was building a coalition with evangelicals who at the time were not politically active and were not registered to vote. It was a coalition between the creepy, greedy capitalist Republicans and the crazy anti-gay, anti-abortion evangelical Republicans. The coalition that is controlling our lives right now. And abortion, which was legal and made legal in New York City in 1971 and legal nationally in 1973. In 1979, there was the Hyde Amendment, where Medicaid funding to abortion was cut. So from then on, poor women could not get abortions except in 7 states that had Medicaid funding. So basically, we only have had abortion rights in this country from 73 to 79. So that's when I came on the scene, and I covered the right wing and I covered the anti-abortion movement. I went to right wing conferences, and then, you know, the cataclysm, Reagan was elected. The condition for gay people at the time was homosexual sex was illegal. In fact, sodomy laws were not overturned until 2003. You could be fired from your job for being gay in New York City. You could be kicked out of your apartment. You could be refused service in a restaurant or a hotel, which is what happened to me twice. You had no right to public accommodation. Familial homophobia was the norm and was culturally virulent. And street violence against gay people from the police and from straight people was like a form of public entertainment called gay bashing. So this was a profoundly oppressed group of people. And the big issue for gay people in New York was that we wanted a gay rights bill that would make discrimination illegal. And this did not come until 1986. Anyway, in 1981 is when science first recognized the pattern that has come to be known as AIDS. And from that moment on, AIDS history has been nothing but revisionism. And it's the underground and community-based writers who have been the pushback against the official lies about AIDS. So the first public announcement was July 3rd, 1981, New York Times headline, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco. Now, just to explain to you what that means, at that time, because homosexuality was so stigmatized, the prevailing idea was that, see, now we know that sexuality is different in each person and it changes over your lifetime, but that was not known at that time. The idea was that homosexuality is one thing and it has one cause, and that cause is biological. So when they said 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals, what they meant was the disease, the biological disease of homosexuality itself is now presenting in the form of this virus. And the first name for this disease was gay-related immune deficiency. Now, let me just tell you, there's no such thing as gay-related immune deficiency. There's no biomarker for any sexuality. But they described it in biological terms. And if you look back, you can see phrases like gay cancer. There's no such thing as gay cancer. Gay cancer cannot be gay. But those were the ways that people were thinking. So the mainstream press, for the most part, ignored AIDS and refused to cover it. The New York Times would not say the word gay. They would not say if someone died of AIDS. They wouldn't allow anyone to be survived by their partner. It was only the underground press that really was able to address these issues. So for the first 5 years of the AIDS crisis, when 40,000 people died in this country, I was involved with a small group of people who were covering AIDS for the underground media. And some of the issues that I covered, pediatric AIDS was huge in New York City at the time. A lot of people were born HIV positive. Today, no one in the United States is born HIV positive, because when women who are HIV positive are pregnant, there are drugs that they can take today so that their child will be born negative. But at the time, it was enormous. I covered how women were excluded from experimental drug trials. In the 1960s, there was a drug that was given to pregnant women called thalidomide, and thousands of women had children born without limbs. And they sued pharma, and pharma had to pay out millions of dollars. So pharma decided no more women in experimental drug trials. Women could not get experimental drugs. And when you have a disease like AIDS, for which there were no treatments, experimental drugs were the only treatments. So women were excluded. And of course, women who were HIV positive tended to be poorer, tended to be women of color in larger numbers. And also women get diagnosed with diseases at a later stage of development than men do, because women don't go to the doctor because they're poor or they're taking care of somebody else or whatever. So the death rates for women were really accelerated. And the government's definition of AIDS was based on the gay male model. So what the symptoms that women got did not qualify to that model, and women could not even get benefits. That was the condition. So those were kind of the issues in that early period. And then in 1987, you get ACT UP and the AIDS activist movement, of which artists and writers were a huge part of the dynamic. But I just want to go through a kind of timeline a little bit about revisionism and pushback on fake ideas about AIDS that we've had to deal with all these decades. So you have the AIDS activist movement, which won huge victories. And although they did not defeat AIDS and they did not defeat capitalism, millions and millions and millions of people are alive today because of that movement. Now, ACT UP had a split in 1992, and by 1993, it started to dissipate. 1996 is the protease inhibitors. Those are the good drugs that you can take that will allow you to live a normal lifespan. And 1999 is the internet revolution. So ACT UP was a pre-internet movement, which meant that there was no email, there was no YouTube, nothing was digitized. The way we exchanged information was that you would go into a room and someone would come into that room and they would tell you. That's basically how you found things out. Or there was video activism, where video activists would create VHS videos and send them snail mail to people in other parts of the world. And that's how we communicated. So when the internet revolution came, if you had Googled ACT UP in 1999, you would have found nothing. Okay, 2001, I'm driving around in LA in a white rental car, trying to sell something to Hollywood, as I'm still trying to do and have never succeeded. And it's the 20th anniversary of AIDS. Now, let me just say it's actually the 20th anniversary of noticing AIDS. But at that time, it was called the 20th anniversary of AIDS. And I'm listening to the radio, and the guy says, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. Okay, this is the next revisionism, right? Because it's, I almost crashed the car. It's like, that is the opposite of the truth. It's not that the benevolent dominant culture finally realized like, oh my God, we should be nice to people with AIDS. What actually happened is that thousands of people fought until the day they died to force the country to change against its will. So I talked to my collaborator, Jim Hubbard, who was also like a post-Holocaust Jew. We're the same age, and we have that same sense of responsibility to the dead and commitment to history and all of that. And we decided to start the ACT UP Oral History Project, which I wish you would visit our site. It's www.actuporalhistory.org. And for the next 18 years, we interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP and made all the materials available. And if you go to the website, you can watch all the interviews. You can see a special archive of the Latino caucus that's on the website. And we just did everything open access. And Jim collected 2,000 hours of archival footage. Now, in a movement, in my book, I cover 6 years. So 2,000 hours is like nothing, right? It's like 82 days or something. But that's what we had, because at the beginning of AIDS, people were still shooting in film, 16 millimeter and Super 8. There was no technology for recording off a television set. You would aim your film camera at the television screen and film it. That was how you recorded TV. So, and then the camcorder was invented, and then you get video activism, and then we start to get footage. And then Jim made a film called United in Anger, A History of ACT UP. And I just want to say a few more things. That film took 10 years to make because we couldn't get funding for it. Why? This is a very interesting thing. We went to documentary funders, and they said, a documentary is the story of 5 characters on a journey. And we're like, no. We can't do that, because this is a story of hundreds of people. This is the story of the huge coalition and how all these different communities worked together or didn't work together. And they were like, no. So because of formally, they were trying to force us into a false history. And we said no, then we had to raise the money through the grassroots way. And at the end of the film, there's a list of the 400 individual donors who gave us money to make the film. And then we sold the archive to Harvard to pay for post-production. Anyway, all of this, and then at that point, suddenly in 2012, this other kind of work starts to appear, and I'm not going to name it, that claims that 5 white individuals or 6 white individuals transform the AIDS crisis. And this is what I call the John Wayne problem. You know, as Americans, we're always depending with John Wayne, right? The white, heroic, individual male who's supposed to come in and rescue everything. Okay, first of all, this person doesn't exist. And if they do come, it's usually to cause problems and they don't rescue anybody, but we're perpetually have to deal with this image. And that's what they were doing. And it was driving us crazy because not only was it completely false, but it's also impossible. Because the way change gets made in this country is through coalition, right? It's not through heroic individuals. So then we had to fight back against that story, you know, and it's this constant revisionism. And that's why I had to write this 700-page book that talks about 140 people of all races and genders, who very, very broad coalition, from a Haitian Underground Railroad to housing works to needle exchange to women with HIV, is how the paradigm was shifted. So from 1981 till today, it's been a lifelong journey as a writer of fighting against these corporate produced paradigms and tropes that make it impossible for the present to learn from past activist movements because they are not accurately represented. Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Sarah. Yo, like, I mean, I'm gonna pass it to Jane in a second, but so much of what you're saying, like, really hits this note, man, like about battling revisionism, particularly. I'm thinking about, like, you know, community folks, or like, you know, just like the way that multiple communities working in coalition or working in formation, how the work that gets done can actually be seen, that we can learn from each other. So we're not reinventing the wheel, but also, and we'll get into this a little bit later, how that grassroots in a place like New York that is just like smothered in NGO funding and nonprofits can actually break through and actually get, like, you know, get some sunshine so that we can actually see each other and hear each other. I'm also gonna like just throw in the ether something about like being unseen, you know, and like a fugitivity, you know, maybe the way Fred and Stefano talk about it, you know, something that maybe was just like by default back then, which is like the snail mail, the like you have to actually be looking at somebody to trade information, the I meet you in the first cart at 5 o'clock, don't be late, uptown side kind of a thing about it, where it's like, you know, you're operating outside of technology. And now, you know, I'm not one of those people who hate on, you know, like, you know, technology, but I do hate on surveillance, you know, and so like, I wonder if that might be a tool for the toolbox, you know, the unseen and the maybe operating outside of technology. But we'll table that for now and leave it for the discussion portion. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, you know, I'm honored to follow Sarah, whose books I've loved, Gentrification of the Mind and Conflict is Not Abuse. Just the titles, both, you know, blew my mind. And I'd love to hear you give much longer talk on everything, but I'm gonna jump in here and share my screen, and I'm gonna talk a bit about, here, let's see if I can figure out how to do this. I'm going to talk about, you know, my personal journey through this period and the people that I was intersecting with, because in your question, Shellyne, you were like, well, you know, what did you guys do and what can you do today? And it was we didn't realize what a lucky time it was on a certain level. It was a mess, but it was the powers that be had kind of abandoned New York. And I'm going to go right on to my second image. This is a John Fechner image. I mean, John Fechner did a lot of, and he's still doing a lot of artwork, public artwork. And this one was in the South Bronx and it said decay. And then Reagan came and gave a public talk in front of it. So I'm going to give you a few images that are just to set the stage, which Shellyne already did, but I'm going to sort of do it some more. This is 149 Ludlow Street. If any of you have been in the Lower East Side, you can notice that it doesn't look like this anymore. Anton van Dalen lived in that neighborhood and was making art of it then. Christy Rupp was, is a wonderful artist whose work is all about ecology. And this was during the garbage strike, and I actually helped her. Everybody was doing things and everybody was helping each other. So Christy's like, oh, I just made all these rat Xeroxes and I want to go paste them up around the city. So I went out with her at night and we pasted up lots of rats in all the places that rats lived. This is a burnt out car on 2nd Avenue, and that's actually David Vonorovich. I happened to run into him there. It was near Veselka. And back in this period, people would steal cars all the time and like take the radio and the tires and then whatever else they could strip, and then they'd set it on fire. When I first moved to New York, I remember as I was driving in, there was this wailing of the horn in the vacant lot next door. And it's because when you burn a car and the flames hit the horn, it just goes and goes and goes. So anyway, David was like, oh, I'll hop in the car and, take my picture there. And it's not a great picture. It's a little blurry because it was late at night. And also back in this period, the only way you knew what people were doing, as Sarah's already said, is you ran into them. So I ran into David and he's like, he was with Peter Hujar and it was like, oh, it's Peter's birthday. So we went and had dinner to celebrate Peter's 50th birthday. This is, Shellyne shared a picture. This is the view out of my studio where I lived. I don't know if you can see, are you seeing the whole image? I'm seeing people in front. Okay, so you can see Show World is across the street and up at the top is Port Authority. So I'm just gonna quickly go over, when I first came to New York, I worked as an animator for a wonderful artist who had been my teacher named Susan Pitt. And I was cell painting this film that then got to open at the Whitney Museum. And when I finished working for her, I answered an ad in the New York Times that said, artists wanted, willing to learn computers. This is 1978. There were no computer animation programs in any schools yet. So they knew they had to train somebody. And I was like, sure, I know how to paint cells. I can learn computers. So I got this job working on this billboard that's at One Times Square. It's where the ball drops and the zipper goes around it. And as part of the job, we had to do a certain amount of public service announcements. So I went to my boss and said, hey, can I do a public service announcement for asparagus at the Whitney? And he let me do that. So that was in 79. And then I did one for Charlie Ahern's early Kung Fu movie, The Deadly Art of Survival. And I did some that I asked permission for, and some I did guerrilla style. Scott and Beth Bede did a movie and I did the titles for them. And I said, just stand under the sign at 11 p.m. when I shut off the normal programming, have your camera running, and you can shoot your titles, which I don't have here, but anyway. So then I convinced my boss to let me do an ad for the Times Square show, which was a project that was group organized by all these artists from a group called Collaborative Projects, which were all young, unknown people that were sharing their energy. I always think of collab as being like stone soup, because everybody felt like we had nothing, but whatever you had, you'd be like, oh, you know, Walter Robinson's like, well, I'm working for an art magazine, so I'll, you know, write about it, or I'll invite somebody I know. And I was like, well, I work on this billboard, maybe I can get my boss to let me run. So this is like, I did do the poster. I was already drawing out the window. My office was right under the sign there, that window, but actually we had windows all the way around the sides. So I was already drawing like the 3-card Monte people. So I did the poster, and then I convinced my boss. And because I was programming it, I ran it every 20 minutes for a whole month. So we'll go on. Okay, so we've already seen that poster. This is the Times Square show. Somebody knew somebody who knew someone at the Durst organization, and they let us use an empty building on 7th Avenue and 40th Street for a month. And there's a lot of well-known artists in this photo. Richard Mock, who's passed away, Tom Modernist, John Ahern, and Tom Modernist did. Oh, and Christy Rupp's little rats are running around the bottom there. I feel like she hasn't fully gotten her recognition yet. Okay, this is what I contributed to the show. Woman with red shoes, and then these Xeroxes, which I'm going to zip along. I thought of this as my first serious artwork. I was like, I only want to make art about things I know about. What do I know about? And I thought, well, I know about boyfriend troubles, couple troubles. So I started making cartoons of them, and then, and I don't know if she's still here, but I saw that Ann Turin had logged in tonight. So Ann Turin, again, was just self-motivated, and she went, I'm going to start this series of publications of women called Top Stories. And you can see the first 10, there's Kathy Acker, Jenny Holzer. So she asked me to do one, and I said, oh, I have these drawings of this whole series. And then I went to Lynn Tillman, who hadn't published anything yet. She was my neighbor. And I said, Lynn, would you write a text to go with my illustrations? So it happened backwards. And for any of you that are interested in Top Stories, they've just reissued the whole series, and they're having a launch for that at Artist Space on this Sunday afternoon. I think it's 3 to 5. There's a panel. And this is just the first edition of 10. There were more than one. And I'm flying around through projects that I was involved in, that were involved in collaboration and social interaction. So I'm not really showing my paintings, but I did a number of projects at Fashion Moda, which I had to narrow down, but the main one was called City Maze, and I did a really fun video for it that's, I think, on my website if you want to see it in action. But I just thought I wanted to do something that would make the kids in the neighborhood go crazy, because they kept hanging out at this art place because they didn't have any place else to hang out, and there wasn't that much of interest to little kids. So, and also at this point, I had gotten to know Crash and Days and Knock because I was helping Charlie Ahern do Wild Style, and Crash lived right near Fashion Moda on 139th Street. So I said, I want to make this labyrinth, and I want kids to be able to, anybody who wants to come and tag up on it, but I want you guys to start by spraying on it to get the ball rolling. So they loved it so much. Every day they'd, like, after school, they'd pound on the door to be let in, because they couldn't wait to get in there and run around and scream and play. And then at that, because I had brought them into to Fashion Moda the next month, Crash curated a very important graffiti show, and he painted the facade for it. And he was in high school at this point, and he still remarks that I treated him like a fellow artist and not like a kid. And he was just astonished. And Stephanites who ran it was like, oh, this is cool. You want to do the next show? And Crash, because he was in high school, was like, I don't know what a show would be. Let me bring in all my boys and everyone will do a show. So, you know, there is certainly in the whole world and in the art world, a lot of, you know, I'm doing mine, fuck you. But I've always tried to work with people and interact with people. And I feel like everybody gets more that way. It's more interesting. I'm interested in a dialogue as opposed to, you know, a lot of times, especially the art world ends up being a whole series of monologues. I'm just going to talk about me. He's going to talk about him. We're not really going to talk to each other. So we don't want to do that. Okay. Joe Lewis was the co-organizer of Fashion Moda with Stephanites. And this is from our loft in Times Square. And I was doing portraits early on textured vinyl. This had been a doctor's office before we moved in there. And that whole block was slated for demolition, which is how we could afford to live there. And then Joe Lewis decided he was going to publish books. And he's like, oh, I'm going to become a book publisher. Do you want to do a book? And I said, oh, well, I've just been doing these drawings of pickup lines that I'm getting as a young woman in the city. I was cute at the time. And, you know, hey, honey, want a lift was.
Jane, you still cute.
Thank you. So women always thought this was funny and men were like, oh my God, somebody's actually looking at me when I've got a heart on. And Keith Haring, who I had met at the Times Square show also when he was a student at SVA, did one also. And we sat in Jimmy DeSanta's, for a while Keith was running Jimmy DeSanta's loft, which was not far from where I lived. It was by Bryant Park. And we each had to staple all of our own books. So we sat there in Jimmy's loft in each, and then I threw these in because I gave a talk on Keith recently. And there was a big women's march for choice. And I did this poster, which ended up in the Village Voice, and Keith stood on the side at Bryant Park and handed out his Radiant Baby. I'm not sure if that was the first place he did it. And this is just a portrait of Jimmy DeSanta, who was one of the many, victims of AIDS who we loved and missed. And I carried a camera with me all the time. Note to you young artists, you don't know what's going to be of interest later. And I thought, I want to be a witness of my time. I'm not so interested in expressing my personal emotions as being a witness and a documenter. And I can do that better visually than in writing. So I carried my camera all around. Film was expensive, so sometimes you'd run out. You wouldn't have it, or you'd run out. But nowadays with your phone, everyone can take pictures everywhere. And you're like, okay, they're so easy, who cares? But they're really valuable in the long run. And this is like some dinner with Martin Wong and Yasmin Ramirez. Martin Wong, another wonderful artist, old friend, and sadly lost to AIDS. Yasmin Ramirez is a brilliant curator. She did the Young Lords show a couple of years ago. So we've been friends and in conversation since the early 80s. I mean, Yasmin and I are still in conversation. Martin is sadly no longer with us. And then I got in touch with the Public Art Fund and agreed to do a whole series of artist projects if they would let me curate the first year, because I said, I know a lot of cool young artists right now that no one's heard of, and I would like to give them, it would be fun to collaborate with my friends on this very public thing. So, you know, I have had a long history of somehow wheedling my way into situations of power and convincing them to let me use it somewhat for good. So I thought, who are my friends whose work would work on this very simple billboard? And nobody had ever heard of Keith Haring. He was, like I said, a college student at that time. But I'd seen him he had just started to do these characters. So I thought, I can animate these. So for each artist, I sat down like I would if I was doing an ad for Coca-Cola, and I'd ask them, you know, to fill out a storyboard, and then I'd animate it for them and have them come in and go, oh, the dog is too big, or the movement I think should be slower, whatever. So I was really collaborating through the whole process. And I also introduced Jenny Holzer to LED signs as part of this, because she was doing paper cups. And I thought, well, these really seem like they should be on a billboard. And I also invited David Hammonds, who I'd gotten to know, and Crash. And it was a star-studded group of, there was one artist a month. And then it ran for 9 more years. I had quit working at the billboard, and I had quit. For a while, I was on the artist board of the Public Art Fund. So I was helping pick artists for all kinds of things. Like at one point, the Department of Transportation came to the Public Art Fund and said, can you recommend an artist? We want to do an artist residency at the Department of Transportation. And just, I don't know why, I said, what about Martin Wong? He does all these symbols for the deaf. And they did a whole series of signs with Martin, which were, they're very cool. I have photos of them, but I'm not showing them right now. So this is what my messages to the public said: let them eat cake. And then it went, and it had a gun target, and it ends up, and it was sort of a Pac-Man style thing. And then it ended saying, let them eat cake, the pie's all gone. And the midnight moment now is gonna honor me at the end of this year, because they say I initiated public art in Times Square, which is now 30 years of, well, actually this was 82. I guess that's 40 years of digital art in Times Square. And this was my little Xerox that I made to invite my friends to celebrate when mine ran on New Year's Eve after the ball dropped, and I got to run the ball drop. I invited all my friends to go to this bar, Tin Pan Alley, to celebrate the showing of all these animations. And if any of you have seen that TV show, The Deuce, Tin Pan Alley was the bar in The Deuce. I'm showing you this one because being on this panel for the Public Art Fund, where I was doing stuff for other people, one of the other panelists was Sandra Bloodworth, who runs Arts for Transit for the MTA. So I got to know her just being on this panel. And then when she needed an artist to do poster for Times Square, she was like, Jane, maybe you should do this. I know you do Times Square. So I did this poster, and then 15 years later, when it was time to get someone to do mosaics for the subway, Sandra was like, maybe we should ask Jane again. So I did New Year's Eve revelers that run between Port Authority and Times Square. So I'm just saying that things come because, you know, they don't just come because you're chasing people going, me, me, me. And I wasn't trying to hustle her. I just had gotten to know her. Another thing that Collab did that does still exist, because one of Shellyne's questions was what still exists from then. Collaborative Projects did a show called The Real Estate Show, which led to the city giving us our choice of buildings, and my friends chose ABC No Rio. This is the old No Rio, which has been demolished, but the new one is about to be Construction is starting on the new one being paid for by the city. So that is a legacy that's gone. The real estate show, we broke into a building on Houston Street on New Year's Eve and put up an art show. And when the city kicked us out, they gave us another place. And I personally didn't get involved in the negotiations of this. I was like, oh my God, this is way too much work for me. But particularly Rebecca Howland and Alan Moore stuck with it, and it's provided exhibitions for many, many people. I threw this in because I was in a performance at No Rio, and that's what I once looked like. So I wanted to throw that in. And on the right is Nan Golden, who took those beautiful pictures of me in Times Square earlier on.
I think this is a great place to like pause
Right.
questions, right? Jay?
Okay, and actually this was some event that Joe Louis was doing, and he was my friend from Fashion Moda. So I was like, oh, and Cookie Mueller made the bikinis. They're made out of camouflage.
Wow. The whole connection.
Yeah, but you know, and when I've talked about this in the past, sometimes students go, how do you meet famous people? And I have to say, none of these people were famous when I knew them. They just were, you know, there were people that were doing things. And I was like, that sounds cool. I'll do things too. So this is a really crappy photo of the window of Fun Gallery, the original Fun Gallery, with one of my paintings of a guy with I called him Bus Stop Boy because I looked at him and I was afraid of him. And then I realized he's actually a kid and he's afraid of me too. And I was the only woman who ever had a solo show at Fun Gallery. And there I am with
really a whole squad of people.
a whole squad of people.
Right.
And I'm not going to be able to think of, oh, Arch Connolly is the last one, early AIDS casualty. Kenny Scharf, me, Futura,
Gandhi.
Freddie, Dondi, Kylie Jenkins, and Patty Astor.
Can we move to questions real quick from here?
Sure.
There's just so much, you know, we
Yes.
have about like 30 minutes left.
Yes, okay. I'll stop. Should I unshare this?
No, leave it up actually
Okay.
for a second. So a few things. First, I want to point out what Jane says, which is none of these fucking people were famous, but I don't think that, you know, fame is the wrong thing to be thinking about. I think that what made these people, you know what, actually, Jeremy, you know, who used to say this shit all the time is Kenter. This is like, it's not that they were famous, it's that they're renowned because of their contributions, because of what they brought to the table, what they left behind. So it's a thinking of like all of us being ancestors in training to a degree. What are we leaving behind? You know, Jane doesn't know a bunch of famous people. She knows a bunch of people who left something behind or in the process of leaving something behind, that we're picking up the pieces. My generation is picking up. Definitely, I picked up those pieces. And perhaps, you know, y'all coming behind my old ass are going to pick up maybe pieces that I leave behind, perhaps. So this kind of idea, I think, is really like the gist of what my fantasy about this talk could be, you know? What do you think, Sarah?
Well, I'd like to hear
I was
what's
smiling a lot at when Jane was showing pictures.
I was loving every second of it, and I'm remembering quite a bit of it. I'd like to hear what some of the people out there want to talk about.
Folks got questions?
Thanks for having this. I just like, I want to just kind of respond, like, really like that clip from Beat Street. I mean, I'm born and raised in New York City. You know, I used to write graffiti too, so that all that stuff is not new to me. But I really just like that, how innovative, you know, the example and reference it was for being innovative and creating stuff out of necessity, using what was there, you know, in which case they were like tapping into a resource that was there that wasn't, you know, necessarily designed for them to use, you know. And also just like with graffiti, keeping in mind, like in the 70s and 80s, you know, this was an art form that was developed by kids. You know, these kids were like 12 years old, you know, organizing and executing missions, like, you know, painting the train system. And so it's like, you know, if they could do that at 12 years old, you know, what could we do? You know, it's not too late, you know. And I was just like thinking a lot about that. But I could go off, but I'm gonna just hold my tongue and listen.
Thank you, Jasper. Thank you for keeping it short too. We're running out of time. Any other questions? Well, since ain't nobody got questions right now, Sarah, you want to complete the thought you started?
You know, I think a lot of it is about what is the definition of an artist, and that has really changed. Right now, being an artist is a profession. You get professionalized, and whatever school you go to serves as your brand. It's kind of like your gang, and then you get your network and all of that. But I think that and Jane, please tell me if you disagree. I think our definition was an artist is a person who makes art, who talks about art, and who goes to look at art. And what happened in that way is that each person had a path of eclectic influences. Nobody had the same influences. Like you would wander into this thing, you would have this conversation over here, somebody would hand you that book, that sort of thing. In professionalization, you have the selection process, you have the cohort, you have everyone reading the same book, you have the influential teachers, and I'm part of it myself. But I think that it produces a very different kind of voice out there. And, you know, and so certain kinds of wild personalities who can't survive in an institutional setting, who are not well behaved enough, or can't afford it, or don't have the time, or are constantly in conflict with authority, those kinds of people cannot get through that new apparatus that's in place. So, you know, I think that's just a really different concept of what an artist is.
If I can jump in on that, I completely agree. And I would say that everything has been professionalized, not just the arts. Like real estate has been crazy, you know, professionalized. It used to be people would rent something and, you know, if they owned something, they rented it, they got some money, but now it's like everybody who's in real estate has got an MBA and they know how to maximize their return. And the same, like, you know, the different people I'm mentioning who are like, oh, I think I'll publish some books, or I'm going to open my own art space. Like Fashion Moda in the Bronx was just Stephan Eintz said, I think I want to make an art gallery in the South Bronx, and I'm just going to rent a place and then see how I can scrape up the money. So, you know, alternative art spaces didn't really exist. And then Patty Esther's like, oh, I'm going to open a gallery in the East Village. That was the first gallery in the East Village. And it was just because she knew a guy who was working in real estate, and he's like, oh yeah, I can get you a basement for $200 a month or something. So every aspect of our society in New York has been professionalized in the past 40 years, so that it's really hard to get into anything unless you're doing I mean, even teaching like you're doing, Sarah, and I used to be, you know, was a MA or equivalent, but now it's like, no, you have to have that degree. Everything is professionalized, and that's what makes it so much harder for.
Well, I think, you know, in terms of like of the creativity that our contemporary moment demands, we're in this very strange paradox, right, where there's empty space everywhere in the city, but it's seized. You know, the housing stock is seized. Today, Tiffany Caban introduced commercial rent control bill into the city council. It's something that we've been needing for, 50 years. But we have all this empty space. And what we haven't figured out is how to interact with that empty space. You know, some people are doing pop-ups, but that requires capital. But I think artists who are really creative can come up with a way right now to interact with empty spaces in a way that highlights the inequality around empty space, instead of what we're doing right now, which is ignoring it and walking past it. I mean, we haven't figured out a way to address it.
Mhm. Can I jump in right here? I think this is a perfect time for me to talk some shit and to respond to some of the questions in the thread. I'm looking at Dennis right now. How can we organize in the current situation of COVID and the corporatized internet? I think the problem with organizing is the fucking internet. You have to organize where you are. You have to be where you are, what is around you. What's going on in the laundromat? What's going on in the bodega? Who lives on your floor? Do you know your neighbors? Like, I mean, it's like simple as that. It's about a weaving of a social fabric. And then like, if you can identify what the spaces are around you and you see the people that are around you, artists or not, elder or not, you know, like whatever, you know, then that's where possibility starts to become sort of like, you know, interesting. That's where the thing is. Christiane, that's a long ass question. I gotta look back at that for a second. But Chris, to navigate institutional spaces, what values should be considered to not sell out when your roots are in local community spaces? I understand institutional spaces, like, you know, I have a hostility towards institutional spaces. You see what I'm saying? Like when things become institutionalized, then they become, you know, like that becomes a kind of an authority in the state. And so I think the best, but also we're not in a situation to do it all ourselves right now. This is the problem with nonprofits. You see what I'm saying? Like with grassroots in New York, like, you know, we want to say fuck nonprofits, but nonprofits are the ones that are helping people get their medical insurance, that are like, you know, navigating like people paying their rent and like, you know, it's like social services. It's like subsidized social services by the state. We're not in a position, you know, on a revolutionary level to like address that as a people. So we can't take that from the community, not right now, but we can be antagonistic to it and make our own shit. You know what I'm saying? Like we're going to eat off of that on different degrees, because there is no such thing as like not being like, you know, we're all complacent by default. That's capitalism. It makes you look at what they did with the pensions of the public sector workers. They bailed out New York and neoliberalism was born. So there's that contradiction is going to be ever present. But what can we make? Like, you know, that's like the wrong argument to think about. Like, you know, because like, it's like, how am I not stepping in shit? Yo, everybody walks their dog here. You see what I'm saying? The shit is everywhere. You're going to step in shit. But what are we making in the next block? And I think that's the focus. It's like, what are the possibilities? You know what I'm saying? Like, are we like, you know, I think that, you know, I would go as far as saying like, yo, let's make New York the 10th city it fucking already is, because let's tell the truth about it. I'm starting to pop all the lot. Like I'm saying, like, get the bolt cutters and, you know, all of that nice restaurant furniture and all that outdoor seating. That's looking like something. You know what I'm saying? Like all of that cover when people are like people need shelter. Adams is kicking them off the train. Start popping locks on them like outdoor restaurant little cubbies and see what happens. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to force the contradiction to the surface, and that's really all we can do. That's what I think.
I mean, I'd like to see artists making work that asserts the public sphere, making art in public, addressing the public-private divide. I'd also love to see younger artists making work that creates interpersonal conversations and helps people go through a process of communication, live and in person. I mean, I think, you know, that stuff that coalesces community, that builds relationships, going through a conflict with another person and coming out the other end with the support of the collective is cohering and unifying, and it's an experience that we don't have right now. So I would love to just see artists being more in the world and in society and more visible and making art in public and bringing people together.
That's the thing about like the Beat Street clip, you know, it's like, it was like artists, it was the DJs, it was the dancers, but it was also like community coming together to turn the power on, because that was an abandoned building with no power. And so like, it gives you both things. It gives you, we can create a space that we need and give something to community, but we are also going to, you know, and we're using our creative faculties to do that. You see what I'm saying? It brings it together. It's not separated. And I think that's why like Jane, like, you know, like what I gathered from Jane's talk, which is like, you know, man, we were all doing this shit together and we trying to figure it out. And, you know, Jane's context is Jane's context and ours is ours. But it's like, you know, we're all doing this shit together and we trying to figure it out. Shout out to Tom Otterness. And you know, like I want to just point to Tom Otterness's piece on 14th and 8th. Bro, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know, just because, like, I'm thinking about like anti-capitalist images in public art, you know, like I'm thinking about like that little figure, those little Monopoly figures sitting next to you on the bench. I'm thinking about like the sleeping figure underneath the subway. I know y'all seen it on 14th and 8th, that sleeping figure underneath the subway. You know what I'm saying? Like the different ways that, like, you know, nothing is new under the sun, man. We have been for a long time and they have been for a long time. And the folks that came before them have been for a very, very fucking long time, trying to subvert and trying to like intervene, you know, on a program, on a template. And so like, you know, it's like, this is about a, you know, like, how do we think together about that intervention and continue to like have that shit on the surface, you know?
Can I just throw in an interesting fact about that piece of Tom's?
Yeah.
Because I asked him, how do you get the MTA to agree to let you do these edgy pieces? You know, they're not all cute. And like down where he has the park down by Battery Park City, there's a, you know, of image of Malcolm X under this, you know, reading under a street light. And I was like, Tom, how do you convince them? Because I've been on these committees and everybody's like really nervous about anything that can offend anyone. He said, what I do is they, you know, they commission me to do, I don't know, 10 figures or something for the MTA, and the same for the one down here. And they're the most bland ones. And then once he gets those in there, he goes, you know what? Let me donate a few more figures to you. Let me donate, you know, and then he kept adding and kept adding, and all the edgy ones, the little homeless person, the city didn't approve of, didn't commission him to do that. And he said, well, when you say you're going to give it to them, then they're like, oh, sure. So that's how he gets, and he goes, then I make, you know, an edition of 5. So I gave the city 1 bronze, you know, for free. And then I have 4 more like it that I can sell and be like, oh, it's like the ones in the subway. So I thought that was a really smart way to infiltrate the public space and get more controversial art in than you would ever get past some committee.
All right, yo, we cooking, y'all. It's like about 6 minutes. This shit ends at 7:30. So if you got any questions or you want to say something, you know,
I see someone with a hand up. Can I unmute Brett, I think?
Brett, yes. Real quick before Brett, before you go, Brett, Jasper, I see that what you're saying that, you know, y'all built a greenhouse on Quincy and Bedford, and, you know, more. Go ahead, Brett. It's all you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to say that everything I've gotten as an artist is because of other artists. And Jane, I want to thank you for getting my teaching job at SVA, because you left a teaching job, said, Brett, you want to take this job? And I said, sure, I would, Jane. And I just showed up. So showing up is really big part of it. And I just left SVA after 32 years. And I remember that Keith Haring, who I met just on the street, came to me one day and said, hey, this guy I know, Tony Surprise, he's going to start a gallery and I think you should be in it. And I said, well, you have that, you can do that, Keith? He said, oh yeah, he's just asking me who, and I'm just saying my friends. And then when I was teaching at SVA, I had a student, Chris Martin, who's a painter and who was working in HIV and AIDS. And he said, hey, Brett, I'm leaving this job. Do you want to work at this AIDS day treatment program? And I said, yeah, I'll try doing that. And that turned into a 15-year career where I became the director of creative arts in an AIDS day treatment program on 20th Street. So these kind of crossing lines that through networks of people that you meet, especially as artists who tend to cross lines, it was a good way for me to show up at places where I wasn't officially invited, but the artists themselves were the ones who gave me an invitation. And I think that a lot of times people get caught up in the idea of asking permission to do things. And I think that it's better sometimes just to do it, and people will kind of follow. You know, there's always these intersections of networks of people, and each network has its own cosmology. So the intersection of all of these cosmologies creates a universe of artists that all of you have been talking about in the way that you worked in different fields. So you know, that's just my contribution. That I'd like to say that I came out of that whole generation of boomers and still kind of you know, making art. So I think there's always hope where there's art.
Nice. Thank you, Brett.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to close this without really saying this last little thing, which is probably a repetition, but I just you know, this ain't career advice, bro. This is not career advice on here, you know. That's not the point of this talk. You know, everybody want to be an artist, but you already are one. So like, if you are one, you are one. You're gonna do that shit no matter what, and whatever hole you have to be in, you're gonna do that shit. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's about, like, you know, like I think Sarah sort of pointed at it with her remarks. You know, the times that we are living in are fucked. And you know, it's almost like it's almost a tragic comedy, you know. Like we're not inside bubbles, we're not inside white boxes. You have to act where you are, and you have to look around you and then respond. And I think that divorcing yourself from the conveyor belt of schools like SVA, because SVA is a fucking conveyor belt for money. Y'all all know SVA is bullshit. That's not what's going to make you an artist, you know. That's not why you're an artist. And so, like, whether you're an artist or not, because you might leave SVA with a BFA and then be like, I'm not a fucking artist. I know plenty of people who have done that. The point is, it's like, how can you be how can you help to reweave a social fabric where you are? Because that's really what's going to get us past this hard time. And, you know, we're talking through the context of art because this is an art school and I'm an artist and all of that bullshit. But, you know, it's the power that we have. You know, it's the one thing that we can do. You know, we make art. So let's talk about it through that lens. But it's not really just that. You know, Jasper is a gardener and he's talking about that, you know. So, like, what can we bring to the table to, like, weave a social fabric when we are so fucking broken? Dude, we are so fucking broken and fragmented and eating each other alive. Like, the level of cannibalism that I'm seeing socially, particularly on social media, is just like disheartening. So, like, how can we as a, you know, as students, as people, as whoever the fuck you are, to whoever you are, that too, contribute something to a social fabric and get us past this moment? And that means whatever that shit means to you, but I think y'all know what I'm talking about, hopefully. And if not, hit me on the DM. Sarah, Jane, any closing thoughts? Those were mine, I think.
You know, it's like I said, I would love everyone to fill the streets of the city with your art making.
Take space, take all of it, because it's receding and it's just going to capital. So, all right, I think that was it, no? Thank y'all for coming.
Yeah, thanks all so much. I mean, I think one other thing I'd say, Shellyne, is, you know, kind of how you started it. Like, what we're doing here is like acts of memory. And that came to me through all the work that, you know, Jane and Sarah, you were putting up about people who are lost and what they leave behind and how to remember them. It's really, art is bound up with that, that Benjamin thing about the past generations, redeeming the past generations being more important than future perfect grandchildren. It's remembering the people we've lost and what they did to make us who we are.
Ancestors in training, bro.
And building on what they did, holding on to what was good that they did. And building on it from there, because this generation can do all kinds of things that I can't imagine. Shellyne is moving things forward, and I'm sure all your students are too.
Yeah, well, thank you, all three of you so much.
Thank you.
Just brief announcement, on April 14th, we have our last event of the semester, a panel on migration and identity with the Fritz Asher Society of Banned and Ostracized Art. It's going to touch on artists whose careers were destroyed by Nazi Germany, as well as a couple of artists who've come from many different places in the world, and what being an international human being means for your art. So stay tuned for that on April the 14th, Thursday. You'll probably get an email about it after this event. And again, I just want to thank so profusely and profoundly Shellyne for organizing the event, and Sarah and Jane for your contributions, and Shellyne, just all of the above, really wonderful and thought-provoking.
Thank you for coming.